Well, good afternoon, or actually good evening. It's still lighter out there. I'm Paola Subachian, the Research Director for International Economics here at Chatham House. And I will be chairing this meeting tonight. And I'm delighted to see a full room tonight, despite the fact that we are almost at the end of July. And it's quite unusual to have so many people. But it is a special evening, and well, you know the background, and you know what we're going to discuss, and you know why we discuss the reconstructing Britain's trade policy after Brexit. But there is another reason for convening this meeting this evening, and it is to announce a new initiative between the University of Sussex and Chatham House, which is the UK Trade Policy Observatory. And our speakers tonight will say a bit more. And is a new initiative and is a partnership, and it will actually deal, and the intention is to deal with all the issues which will come out from the outcome of the referendum held a month ago. So tonight we will look at some of these issues. There will be more of a conversations. Obviously, we don't have the ambitions to deal with all these issues, but just to give you a flavor of what lies ahead of us. And we have, for this, we have a very, very prominent panel, and it's actually a panel from the University of Sussex, but we mix expertise and skills, because we have really some of the best practitioners in trade policies in this country. So let me start to introduce them, and then we will start with a short introduction by each of them, and then we'll actually have a bit of the debate and a bit of discussion among the panelists, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So we will try to make tonight as more interactive as possible. We want to hear from you, we want to listen to hear from your questions or comments, and again, our panelists will answer those. But let me start with Professor Alan Winters. Alan is a professor of economics at the University of Sussex, but he's also he used to work for both DFID and the World Bank. Then at my right is Jim Rollo, and again, Jim Rollo is Emeritus Professor of Economics at University of Sussex, and is also an Associate Fellow here at Chatham House with the International Economics Department. And then Kamala Dawar is a lecturer of Trade and Commercial Law, again, University of Sussex. And then last but not least, Patrick Lowe, visiting professor at University of Sussex and formerly chief economist at the WTO. The meeting tonight is on record. Is not under the Chatham House rule. We have actually we are filming, and we will video streaming this event on our website. I will. That's enough for me. But I will turn to Alan Winters, and Alan, now just over to you for your introduction to this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Paola. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Let me offer my welcome from the sort of Sussex side of the partnership. 4 weeks ago, I guess none of us would have guessed that we would be here. And so we have been scrambling to catch up ever since. The University of Sussex has had a long-term interest in the world trading system, international trade. We have expertise in economics, in law, in international relations, active research programs. We have an interdisciplinary working group that's been meeting just to talk, as academics do, for the last 2 or 3 years about the world trading system. We've got a number of colleagues who are ex-practitioners who've worked on trade, if not actual trade negotiations. And we also have a university spin-off company that's provided analysis and training in trade areas for several years. So we're just interested in this, and we were wondering what was going to happen, and then it struck us, actually, we could help as well. And that's really the idea of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, that there really is a job of work to be done, And in Sussex, we had the means actually to help quite seriously. I should say we're very pleased to be partnering in this with Chatham House as well. I worked with Chatham House 30 years ago on the single market, as an irony. Jim has been a program director here. And for those of you with long memories, remember that perhaps the very best trade policy economist ever, the Nobel laureate James Mead, published his work on trade and welfare from the Royal Institute for International Affairs, from Chatham House. So it's just exactly the right place for us, as it were, to bring our interests and to share them with people like you. So we think that the Trade Policy Observatory has got some expertise. It's also, two other features are objectivity and independence. Trade policy is really contentious. It's rather political. And we're dealing with the future. So we're sometimes dealing with places where there aren't facts. But at least as academics, we are reasonably good at spotting the difference between fact analysis and opinion. We're independent of any specific political or commercial position, and it is certainly our intention that we should remain so. Now, everyone in the room has read about the urgency of recruiting lots of skilled trade negotiators, and that is very certainly an urgent job. But I'd like to make 2 points about that, in a sense by way of caution. I mean, the first is that trade negotiators negotiate from a brief, but you have to work out what goes into the brief in the first place. And that's where the Trade Policy Observatory will come in. And there's an analogy: when you choose to buy a house, you choose the house, and then you ask the lawyers to work on the details to get it sorted out. It's the same with trade policy. The second word of caution is that most of the people in Britain who have experience of trade negotiations and trade policy have experience as lobbyists. And that is something that we hope that we are different from. The idea of the Policy Observatory is we're going to be producing briefing papers, monitoring what's going on over the short term with trade and trade policy, doing some training, and we're going to have a number of meetings here and certainly also out in the provinces so that we can start a debate on a trade policy for everybody in Britain, not just for London. The idea is that we're fairly responsive to what's going on, so we're dealing with issues that are important of the day, but the sort of things which I expect us to be working on over the next several months would be things like the service provisions, the procurement provisions within the WTO, sort of trade-offs that might be feasible between the single market and the movement of labour. What's feasible and not to think about trade agreements with countries outside the EU. Important element of trade policy for developing countries. We've got to invent an anti-dumping policy, and that is something on which there's lots of information, but it needs to be distilled. And I think there are also the nitty-gritty issues like minimizing the cost of border formalities within Britain. We are going to invent a border where we used not to have one. We don't want it to be too painful. And issues of sort of political importance like trade and wages, trade and income distribution. I'm going to pass over to Jim now to talk a little bit about our very first thoughts about what the WTO option, as David Davis has characterized it, might actually mean. But let me just sort of summarize the couple of weeks' work that we've done in Sussex. It's really persuaded us that this is even the WTO option is actually really rather complex. It's not something that is automatically going to fall into our laps if we're not very careful, and that we really do have to work to get the best out of this rather wonderful trading system that exists in the world ourselves. Above all, I guess, our conclusion is that negotiating trade policy for Britain in the future is going to be a matter of sort of delicacy and diplomacy, and that seeking a constructive relationship with trading partners, indeed all our trading partners, is really a first-order priority for the government.
Thank you, Alan. Jim, you are the bridge between Sussex and Chatham House, and you sit on both. And you're also an expert and an observer of the EU. So Can you just give us a sense of how this relationship, potential relationship with the Britain will be?
Yes. Well, Paula, let me say first that I'm really pleased to be sitting on this platform today. I mean, my two intellectual homes, so to speak. I was a rather nerdy backroom economist to somewhere in Whitehall before I came to Chatham House, and what have you got now? Well, I'll leave you to decide later on. But it was the first start and the first place I could actually, for the first time, say in public what I really thought and really understood. Civil servants don't have that right usually. And the International Economics Programme is a very warm home for me, and so is Sussex. And I'm looking forward to working even more closely with Paula and the team here. I think whatever your stance, there's no doubt that British trade policy is entering a new era, maybe even a new era in terms of trade policy for the world. We could be that ambitious. It's worth just tucking that away for the moment and thinking about it. But I think we now stand between conserving the best of what we've inherited from trade policy in the years as part of the EU and moving into this new world of a really purely national-driven policy. The WTO is, to my view, the bedrock of the global trade system. And it should equally, I would hold, be the bedrock of the new British trade policy. That doesn't mean that it comes with no constraints. I'm afraid sovereignty is going in all sorts of directions the minute you start dealing with the global system. Constraints that the other 160 plus member states will draw on to ensure that the emerging British trade policy doesn't reduce the benefits they receive from their membership. So it's against that background that we decided that the first briefing paper from UK TPO, it really rolls off the tongue on that, looks at the implications of possibly moving back to trade relations based on the WTO if we're in circumstances where we can't get any better conditions out of our former trading partners in the EU, and indeed we don't manage to hold on to the free trade agreements that the EU, membership of the free trade agreements that the EU has negotiated on our behalf and on the behalf, of course, of all the other member states. I think as Alan has said, the more we look at this issue, the more complicated it becomes. And there'll be a particular little example of this when Kamala speaks, I think. So you've got this, some of you have got the working paper or the briefing paper sitting next to you. Those of you who haven't, it will be up on the website tomorrow morning. So you can find it there. I think if you just go into Sussex and type in UK TPO, you'll get through to to where it's lurking in the economics department website, I think, somewhere down there. Now, let me just say a few words about the paper, because we started out, as I say, thinking this would be fairly straightforward, and we found out that it wasn't. And as a result, and that was because there were issues around the way in which mainly quantitative restrictions are set out in the EU schedules that mean that there would have to be a division, rather like how you split the record collection in a divorce in this bit. But the problem is some other people think they own some bit of that record collection. You know, you've borrowed them from friends or other members of your family. And under those circumstances, you can't quite get an agreement in the system because someone else is in the middle. And that's true of these mainly agricultural ones. And just taking that as the main example, there are a number of other examples as we go through, and I may come back to them in conversation. But sorting that out before we start out on the business of agreeing an EU-UK trade policy is quite important. We need to do that soon, or sooner than as soon as we can. Doing that would, I think, depend on us being able to, and that's just the intra-EU bit of it that we need to do as quickly as we possibly can, will depend on whether we can do that under the Article 50 rules. And I would just simply say that those are not clear-cut on the question of whether the so-called tariff rate quotas are part of, how shall I say, the existing estate, or are something to do with our future relations. And that's going to be a repeated theme as we go through the rest of the discussion. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. Now I turn to you, maybe, and to ask you for a few words from your own perspective, which is more legal and more commercial and trade law. So it's different from the background of Jim and Alan, but equally important to our discussion.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, I'm going to talk about procurement. Now, procurement's important because it's good for business and it's also good for governance. And what's interesting here is that the UK is part of the EU with the EU directives on procurement, and yet it's also a member of the GPA. Now, I'm going to talk about three aspects. I'm going to talk about the ratification, I'm going to talk about the renegotiation, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between the GPA, the Government Procurement on Agreement in the WTO, and the GATS, which is the Services Agreement. Now, it is complex and it is a legal situation. The WTO GPA is a plurilateral agreement, which means it's voluntary, and there are 43 parties, of which the EU makes up 28. The text was first negotiated in 1994. It was then renegotiated in 2014 and expanded. Now, what happened was the UK ratified the 1994 agreement, but it has not ratified the 2014 agreement because none of the EU member states have ratified it. The EU has gone in as a signatory party, and it's included the annexes of the member states in their schedules. So it's the EU annexes of which the member states have a part of. So what does that mean in terms of ratification for the UK after, if there is a Brexit? Well, it means that, first of all, the UK has to decide before Brexit whether it should just quickly now ratify. So it clears up one problem. Switzerland is the only party of the WTO GPA which has not ratified so far, and that is because of domestic issues that it's trying to reform. And what it means in practice is that Switzerland still really technically only has access to the 1994 agreement. But de facto, actually, because Switzerland is goodwill, they are actually allowed into the 2014 discussions. But technically, it means until you ratify, you are left with the 1994 provisions. So until the UK ratifies, if it is taken out of the EU schedules, it will only have access to the 1994. So that is a deficit already. Okay, so the UK comes out. Presumably, it will either want to roll over its commitments that it has now, or it wants to expand. Either way, it will have to accede again to the WTO GPA. That means it has to go into bilateral negotiations with every single member, because it's a request and offer system. So it's going to be complicated and it's going to take time. Even if they roll over, they need the goodwill of the parties for consensus to take it forward. Okay, so we have the ratification issue and we have the renegotiation issue, and Patrick's going to talk a bit more about renegotiation. The third issue I want to bring up, which is another complexity, is the GPA covers goods, services, and a combination thereof. However, its services provisions are only pegged at the GATS, so it cannot open up a procurement beyond a GATS schedule. But if a procurement is a good, service, or a combination thereof, it's very complicated to work out which bit the service is and whether it actually fits in with what's already open up under the GATS. So all of these negotiations, whether it's rollover or whether it's to expand, they will have to have close communication and coordination with the services negotiations. So all of this means it's very complicated and it's very unknown, and it means that really the UK has to think very much about the value of its offer and whether if it rolled over it would get value for what the offer is, when you consider that the UK actually makes up 25% of the value of the EU offer. So the UK is quite a big liberaliser when it comes to procurement markets. So I'm just going to leave it there and hand over to Patrick to talk more about renegotiation. Please, Patrick.
If I shall be brief. If I said that and was a WTO delegate, you'd know that I was going to speak for 30 minutes. But I was never a delegate. I want to say something about the WTO, the nature of the WTO. The WTO has a strong legal system and a strong dispute settlement system, but has very weak enforcement. The implications of this is that if you want to keep the show on the road, you've got to be flexible. There's a lot of flexibility. I can give you lots of examples of where people haven't cared about the letter of the law, they've just got on and done it. But for that to happen, you've got to have goodwill. So how do you create the goodwill? Well, one way you don't create the goodwill is to go around and say, I say, old chap, we are the 5th largest. Actually, the 6th now because of the exchange rate. France has overtaken UK. But you can't go around and say this and then expect them to be in a good mood for helping out. So this is actually incredibly important. Statecraft at its best in terms of your ability to communicate and get people to come along with you in making things better for everybody. And instead of making it zero-sum, make it positive-sum. You can do that, but that's a really important aspect. And I want to give you one example of this, referring to the schedules of commitments that everybody has in services and in goods in the WTO. There are people in Geneva, including some of my former colleagues, who claim that it is absolutely unclear that the UK even has schedules. This is terribly troubling, and I often think, well, that's because they're lawyers. Sorry. But the fact is, you can't be a member of the WTO, which the UK has been for a long time now, and then the gap before it, without having schedules. So they've got schedules. But how are they going to separate those schedules from the EU structure? Well, there are two ways of doing this, essentially. One is with a process called rectification, and the other is called modification. If you go into modification, you'll end up having endless negotiations with any number of countries who just want to line up and have a negotiation with you and see if they can extract a little more from you. If you have rectification, it's a technical thing. And you say, this is a technical rectification. We're basically going to take our schedules. We're not going to change anything unless we change them in the direction of making things better. In other words, a bit more opening up, which would be a really good thing to do if you want to generate goodwill, if there's any scope for doing that at all. Then you say, I'm just rectifying, and then there's no negotiation. This can't work for everything. It can't work it can't work where there's pie sharing involved. So tariff rate quotas, it's very difficult to do it there. It's difficult to do it in services where you have market access commitments which are expressed in quantitative terms. There's no way of getting around that. That is going to have to be a negotiation. And again, if the UK is prepared to relax a little bit in terms of what it's offering, maybe it gets an easier ride. I don't know what the political economy is yet. I don't know if it's possible, but that's certainly a question worth asking. So this is just an example of how, if you get the right mood, you can probably get a much easier ride. It's not going to be straightforward. But you also have another advantage. There are only very few countries that individually have been pilloried openly by other members. The UK, if it handles it right, nobody is going to want to be seen to be nasty to the UK. They might want to be, but it'll be very difficult to do it politically. So I think these are things that really matter in terms of how you're going to do it. There are other issues. GPA, we've heard about. There are a whole lot of anti-dumping actions in place. How are you going to divvy that up? There are disputes. You've got to divvy all those things up. So I'm not saying it's just a straightforward thing. But if you could get rectification in goods and services, I think you'd be a long way to creating the kind of critical mass of goodwill to making those other negotiations feasible. So, okay, Brexit happened. I wasn't going to ask for a show of hands of who voted for it. But anyway, so we've got to deal with this reality. So let's make it as painless as possible. And I think there are perfectly viable ways of doing that if people come at it in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think at this point it would be good for those like me who do not know much about trade to have a bit of a summary of which are the options on the table at the moment for the UK. Jim, could you do like 3 or 4 options?
Only 3 or 4.
Or maybe 10. How many do you think are practical and feasible options?
Okay. Now this is not in the briefing paper, so no one's got any commitment to anything I'm about to say in this. But starting from where we are now, we're talking about the WTO option. One option is that we simply revert to WTO terms, to the schedules. We both separate our schedules and apply them against each other. And that would mean, if we take the things which, the sort of simplest things to think about in this context, which are tariffs, take the tariff schedules. This means that we would start, for example, charging 10% tariffs on the imports of German cars, and the Germans would, or the French or whoever would charge 10% on the imports of cars from these people in Sunderland who make cars and Japanese implants. So that would definitely be worse than where we are now. I think that's the first thing you can say, that, and that's something we point up, that is in the working paper. Because now we have not just tariff-free entry, but we've got free entry with respect to what are called technical barriers to trade standards. And in the agricultural area, sanitary and phytosanitary concerns, which is basically food safety and animal and plant health. And those are extremely important barriers for people who are not part of the single market. Those are things that can absolutely stop trade in its tracks. It's not just a matter of making it a little bit more difficult, it will be much more difficult. So clearly that is something we would like to avoid. And one of the things that comes out of the working paper, I think, is a sense of, two senses in this. One, that on Brexit Day, whenever that is, we just continue with the same trade policy as we have now, de facto. We charge the same tariffs as we would, and so on. And we have maybe free exchange on both sides. Difficult to know whether people would open up to that or not. I mean, in the union, that's the other side of the story. But certainly there's an incentive there for minimum disruption to trade through changes in trade policy in this context. Now, I mean, that's the most basic change that we could make. And that would probably be pretty hostile on both sides, you have to say. And that's something that comes back to Patrick's point. I think it's not just in the context of the WTO, but we need careful diplomacy to make sure that I mean, I always think the biggest mistake you can make is to make an enemy by mistake. You shouldn't do that, and that's what good diplomacy is about. It's about stopping you getting in that position. And we need that deployed in the bilateral relationship with the EU 27 in this context. Once we go beyond the WTO system, the option, there are a very wide range of possibilities. Why is that? Because the EU has quite a wide range of models of relationships with third countries, with other countries outside the EU. And that can range from the very deep integration of the European, the EEA, the European Economic Area, which includes the full four freedoms of the single market: goods, services, capital, and labor, or people. And that is an extraordinarily complex relationship. It even has its own set of legal institutions run through the EFTA court. Not the ECJ. I mean, interestingly, if we went into a sort of pure agreement along the lines of Norway, we would be justiciable under a court which sits in Brussels. It seems to me to be a bit odd in the context of sovereignty choices. But anyway, so that's the most intensive relationship we could have, and that would be the closest to the relationship we currently have. There would be some things which would not be quite so good for us, and I hope we're going to do something on this sometime soon, and you'll get the proper story. From there on out, there are all sorts of choices that you can make. You could make a choice about going for the model of relationship that the EU has with its neighborhood, notably Ukraine and similar Eastern European countries. which has quite a large chunk of single market integration in it, but not as much as is in the EEA. You could go for the sort of deal that we're now currently trying to do with Canada, which is a free trade agreement, but it's got some services in it. It's got some other single market aspects to it. We could go for the sort of agreement that the EU has with Canada, with Korea, which was until the Canada one came along, the most ambitious free trade agreement that's around, and that has some single market aspects to it. And in particular, as far as the UK is concerned, it opens up financial services in Korea beyond their GATT schedules on services. I think I'll stop there. I think that gives you an idea of the richness of the field you could be tilling here. You know, if you've got enough imagination, you can think of another gee whiz idea.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to ask Kamala, you described some of the steps that need to be taken, but can you actually think of the schedule of this, how long it will take, just to give us a sense of how complex these negotiations and how long it will take to achieve something?
For procurement, from the negotiations that resulted in the 2014 tax took over 15 years. That was with all the parties.
Just for procurement?
Just for procurement, for modernising the text and for expanding the schedules. The text didn't take very long to approve. It was the negotiation of the schedules, because every party has to negotiate with every other party. It's bundles of bilaterals. So it's not as though we all agree on the same thing. We all have different agreements and then we put them all together. So it's a very complicated process.
So it will take, and I imagine the rest of the panel agrees, then we talk about 10, 15 year scenarios here before everything, a new relationship is in place.
You know, if you don't fix it with the EU, you won't fix it with anyone else. And that's the hardest, and I think it will have to take priority, because if you try to go and say, you know, by 2018 we're going to have a free trade area with other people, which is a multiple of what we've got with the EU, you're just going to be provoking the EU to make it hard. Don't forget that almost half of the EU's, of Britain's exports are to the EU. These things don't change overnight, and the reverse flow is closer to 10%. All this talk about trade deficits is really misleading when you look at the shares. And so I think that the first thing that's going to happen is that the UK goes to the EU with a plan, a proposal. They're waiting for a proposal. This is how we see the redefinition of our relationship with you, and that's going to be immensely difficult because of the immigration tie-in. So that's going to take a lot of creativity. I think the part with the third parties is going to be relatively straightforward, especially if there's not already an agreement in place with the EU. The intermediate, where there is something with the EU, I think there's a pretty good chance that if things with the EU are in reasonable shape, you can simply try to extend the same set of deals with the 35 agreements that the EU has with third parties. But I do believe that the core is getting the EU relationship onto a sound foot.
And I don't think that we should take 10 to 15 years as inevitable. It should actually be an objective of our policy to come up with proposals that can be settled sooner. 10 to 15 years is certainly not in our or anybody else's interest.
And Anna, before I open the floor for questions and comments, could you say something about the relationship with the big regional deals which are on the table, in particular with TTIP, and how this will affect that relationship?
I certainly can't say anything very concrete. Things like CETA, the Canadian deal, TTIP with the US, it's been a struggle so far, even with an apparently unified EU. The Commission is clear they have to be now ratified or at least approved by 38 parliaments and regional parliaments. When you take Britain out of that, the deal looks different from the other parties' point of view. So there will be changes in their attitude now. and quite how Britain and the rest of the EU, and as it were, will combine, will be rather different from when they were a unified group with one voice, from when they are two groups that have to strike essentially item by item deals. So I suppose really the only thing I can say is it just got a lot more complicated. There might be more pressure, so we might be able to sort of overcome our scruples or other people's scruples a bit better. I honestly wouldn't like to say, but it's certainly going to be complicated.